Varsity Shastri. I run public policy and sustainability at Standard Chartered Bank, and I'm also a trustee here at Asia House. I have the privilege today of moderating the discussion. Now, we're delighted to have a full house this evening. So many of you were interested in the topic of the future of the global knowledge economy at a time of populism, at a time perhaps of backlash towards globalization. Now, there is an edgy tone to the topic, and that's perhaps quite deliberate. We've seen over the last couple of years, in particular the Brexit vote last June and the US presidential election. The narrative about the benefits of globalization have changed. Many countries are talking about shutting their door to ideas, to goods and services. All of this, of course, has an impact, a profound impact on the knowledge economy, and that's the topic of discussion today. And I think the critical thing to note is, even during an age where globalization perhaps cannot exist, we still had a free flow of ideas across borders, and that's what made innovation possible. And it's a key lesson we've got to remember as our national authorities begin to put up barriers. We've got a very distinguished panel to help us navigate through these topics today. The way we're going to set up the conversation is we'll have a keynote presentation followed by a panel discussion. And to start us off, delighted to have and introduce Dr. Montserrat Gomendio of OECD. She's the Deputy Director in the Education and Skills Directorate of the OECD. She's got a very good presentation on international perspectives on higher education, in particular talking about the impact of automation and IT on the new economy. And this is a topic that does not get adequate attention in the public debate. In talking about globalization, we all seem to be fighting yesterday's battles, but the reality is public policy challenges increasingly in the next 5 or 10 years is going to be focused on what does IT and innovation mean for new jobs in the economy. So I will give the stage now to Dr. Gomendio. After the presentation, I'll invite our panelists up on stage, introduce them, and then hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion which will provoke interesting questions from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here with you today. So I'm going to present some of the evidence that we have at the OECD on how globalization, the technological revolution, the digital revolution is having an impact on jobs, and how higher education is responding or not to that and the challenges that arise. So this is a cover of The Economist. This is the fear that a lot of people have. What is going to happen to jobs? How many jobs are going to disappear? That is just one of the many figures that people have come up with. It ranges from 9% to 50%. That's not the point that I want to make. The point that I want to make is that the technological revolution and the digital revolution is changing the nature of jobs, is destroying some jobs, and it's creating others. But as we all know, people are fearful of this. They're fearful of whether they're going to lose the jobs and whether they will be able to acquire the right skills so that they get the new jobs that will be created. Now, if we look historically, the digital revolution that's taking place now, it's often being compared to the industrial revolution. If you look at the black line, that is technology. So during the industrial revolution, there was a big technological change. And because education took some time, it was lagging behind, took some time to respond by this, and it did so by giving universal access education to the whole population. Until it achieved universal access education, there was social pain. Now we have the digital revolution. So again, it has an impact on jobs. The nature of jobs is changing. Some jobs are being destroyed. And then education, again, needs to change. But in this case, the question is, in most cases, universal access to education, definitely to compulsory education, has been achieved to most countries. So it's more an issue of improving the quality of the education systems and how do we achieve that and which countries have achieved that. And in this case, I think that Asia is a wonderful example in many countries of how they started 40 or 50 years ago with very difficult starting points. They made a priority of improving their education systems, and they have really improved their education systems, which has led to very inclusive and sustainable economic growth. So this digital revolution and globalization, as I said, it's having a big impact on the nature of jobs and on the type of skills and the level of skills that are demanded from workers from the labor market. So the main change that we see, if we compare 1960 to 2009, is that the demand for what we call non-routine interpersonal and non-routine analytic skills is increasing very rapidly. And on the other hand, all the routine jobs, including the cognitive, and only the non-routine manual are decreasing. So we have an increased demand for people with high levels of skills and with different levels of skills. So this puts a huge effort on education systems to respond quickly enough to this. And by education systems, I'm talking about early childhood education and care, I'm talking about compulsory education, vocational training, university, and adult learning. I'm not going to cover the whole thing in 10 minutes, but when I talk about education, that's what we have in mind. Now, are the returns on higher education still high, despite of the fact that most countries have made a huge effort in expanding access to higher education? Because some people had the worry that once a very high proportion of the population had access to higher education, then the returns would diminish because so many people had a university degree. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. So the returns, both private and public returns to higher education, the private returns are the returns to the individual, the public are the returns to society as a whole that the individual gives back through taxes and so on. I'm sorry that I'm speaking so quickly, but I only have 10 minutes. I'm Spanish and I'm used to speaking this quickly, but if you don't follow, ask me to calm down a little bit. Okay, so we see that in some countries such as Ireland, the United States, and the UK here, the returns are quite high. In other countries, the returns are very low, and the reasons are quite complex, and I don't have the time to go fully into that. But for example, I think it would be fair to say that in Denmark and Sweden, the problem is not the quality of higher education, but rather how these societies work. Most people are employed, salaries are very similar, taxes are very high, and they're very inclusive societies. So the impact of going to higher education is not that high. On the other hand, we have countries such as Spain, I was trying to find other countries. Well, I can't put Spain as an example because I'm from Spain. So Spain, Turkey, Greece, where the returns are low, and we think that has more to do with the quality of the education systems than with how the labor market and tax systems and so on work in these countries. So what are the positive outcomes of having a high level of skills? This comes from a survey of the adult population. It's called PIAC, and it's a survey of all adults in many countries from the ages of 16 to 64, and it's basic skills in numeracy and literacy. It's about whether people can understand texts, it's about whether people can do basic numeracy tasks. So this is important not only for the jobs, but in order to be able to do the sorts of things that we need to do in our daily lives in our current societies. So we do have much higher wages for people with higher level of skills, but we also have other things that are very important and that perhaps we haven't put enough emphasis on. These people tend to be healthier. These people tend to participate more in volunteer activities. They have high levels of political efficacy, so they feel their role in their democratic societies, which in these days, I think we will all agree is really important. And as a consequence, they have high levels of trust, higher levels of trust, both in other people and in their institutions. Now, when we compare different countries, what we could see is to what extent the quality of their education systems differs. And we do this by using, again, data from PIAC, the survey of the adult population, and by looking at people that have attained different levels of educational attainment, and what level of skills do they have according to PIAC. Now, if you look at countries with really high quality education systems like Japan or Finland, you see that people below upper secondary education have low level of skills. They increase if they achieve upper secondary education, and this increases sharply if they go to tertiary education. But as you move to the right-hand side, then you get to countries like Spain and Italy, where education systems are of low quality throughout, from compulsory education to a university. So what you actually see is that the level of skills, again, basic numeracy and literacy skills of a university graduate in these countries is equivalent to the level of skills of someone who has just reached upper secondary education in countries with really high quality education systems. So I use this graph to make the point that putting a lot of emphasis on the quality of the education system is very important. Once you do that, making sure that more and more people have access to higher levels of educational attainment, it's also very important. But just giving people access to higher levels of educational attainment without having a good quality education system is no good. It's no good for the individuals, and it's no good for society as a whole. Here you have an example, again from PIAC, of different countries, and here what we are comparing is the 55-65-year-old generation with the 16-24-year-old generation. In all the arrows, we start with the older generation and we end with the younger generation. You can see, I mean, there are many more countries in the study, but these are just chosen examples. Singapore is a good example, but the same happens with South Korea, and the same is happening with China. It has, compared to, say, the US or the UK, a difficult starting point for the older generation, low level of skills, but as you go to the younger generations, the levels of skills have improved so much that they're actually the top performer in PISA, our survey of 15-year-olds. So there's 16 to 64-year-olds have higher level of skills because things have improved so quickly than in any of the other countries considered. Chile has a very difficult starting point. It has improved, but not as much as it should have. And you go through France, Germany, Lithuania, better starting point, some advancement, never this magnitude. But then you get to countries like the US and the UK, where the starting points were so much better and still very, very little advance between generations. If you look at what employers are demanding, what you see is that what they're demanding of their workers today is very different, and there's a growing mismatch between what universities are equipping people with, the kind of skills that they're equipping people with, and the perception that employers have that those university graduates do not have the skills that they need in the workplace. And this is a survey of employers asking them what would be the top priorities for education policy reform in schools, and they talk about the curricula because they want different kinds of skills, and then they talk about bridging the gap with the labor market and addressing labor market needs, and then a lot of cooperation between the education system and the labor market so that we can bridge this gap. Funding in education has been increasing throughout the last years despite of the crisis in most countries. Here you see all the countries where it's increased, and here you see the countries where it has decreased, but always slightly, and they are recovering. In general, that we find that above a threshold that most OECD countries overcame a long time ago, there is no relationship between investment and student performance, because it matters more how you invest than how much you invest. And the never-ending debate about tuition fees in some countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and countries in Asia. The fees are higher than in other countries, say in Northern Europe. People tend to talk about this as if families should or should not pay for university. I would rephrase that debate. Families always pay for university. Someone has to pay for university, so it's always families. It's about what the right balance is in each country in relation to what the user pays for university given the returns that it's going to enjoy, and what the rest of the families pay through their taxes, even though some of those families may or may not have children going to university anyway. So I'm just showing that there are different models and that it's a difficult and ongoing debate. And this is the final slide. This is about the global distribution of academic graduates. Mobility is increasing very much. This is a bit outdated. So if we look at the share in academic graduates in 2010, then you see that it's mostly in China and the United States, and the UK is here with a really small slope. But if you look at the share in academic excellence, this is the number of universities in the top 100 according to the Times Higher Education ranking, then you can see that the United States and the United Kingdom have a much greater share than you would expect from the number of students. If you look at the Times Higher Education in 2017, as I was doing the taxi coming here, you see that this has changed quite dramatically, because now we have quite a few universities in countries like Singapore, South Korea, China, and Japan rising to the top of the ranking, at least according to the Times Higher Education. And that's it. Thank you very much.